The first time Jonas Weber heard the word radar spoken in the bunker, it was with a laugh. The map room beneath the French coast was thick with smoke and the smell of wet wool. It was February 1943, midnight, and the concrete ceiling hummed faintly with the echo of generators. Pins pricked the North Atlantic in red and black, convoy lanes like veins across a hostile ocean. Jonas, 24, signals officer, stood at the plotting table with a stack of flimsy intercepts under one arm. His pencil traced lines from the Bay of Biscay into the western approaches. U-boats moving, hunting, the Wolfpacks. Behind him, the door slammed. Kapitän Zurse Bremer, one of Dönitz's staff officers, strode in, cap under his arm, a grin already forming. "You should hear what the British are telling their sailors now," Bremer announced, voice echoing off the bare walls. "Some new radar that sees through storms, toys from their laboratories, nothing more." The older watch officers chuckled. One of them, a gaunt Korvettenkapitän with nicotine-yellowed fingers, flicked ash into an overflowing tray. "They invent a Wundergerät every month," he said. "Last year, it was the Codebreakers. Before that, super sonar. We still send ships to the bottom." Laughter again. Jonas smiled because everyone else did, but he remembered the line in one of the Dönitz decrypts from London. References to 10-centimeter sets and microwave radar aboard escorts and aircraft. The report had been passed up the chain and come back stamped with a terse note. "Continue monitoring. No strategic change." He slid a new pin into the North Atlantic grid, marking U-264's last position. Midnight. Sea state rough. Ordered to join Group Amsel, shadowing a slow westbound convoy. "Fresh contact?" Bremer asked, leaning over the chart. "From U-264, Herr Kapitän," Jonas said. "Convoy ONS something, still coded in the report. He sighted them at dusk and is maintaining contact. Several other boats converging." "Good," Bremer murmured. "The Führer wants results. The British must feel the noose." He tapped the map where the convoy lane crossed the open ocean, far from land-based air cover. "The Atlantic is still ours at night, Weber. Don't let the rumors fool you. Rumors, new radars, toys." Jonas nodded and said nothing. Far above them, beyond the concrete and the coastal guns and the thin strip of occupied sand, the Atlantic wind screamed over black water. Waves like moving hills rolled under a low ceiling of cloud. Somewhere within that expanse, another young officer stared into a different kind of darkness. Lieutenant David Miller could taste the salt in the wind even through the bridge dodger. HMS Calder, an aging destroyer refitted as an escort, threw her bow into the swell with a tired metallic groan. Spray burst over the forecastle, blew sideways, and rattled against the bridge windows in sheets. The convoy crawled behind them, a ragged procession of freighters shouldering westward, their dimmed lights and smoke trails barely visible between curtains of rain. In the corner of the bridge, just behind the chart table, a new shape hunched under a canvas hood, the display cabinet of the Type 271 radar set. David pulled the hood back and leaned into the glow. Under the domed cover, the cathode ray tube burned a soft green. The sweep line rotated with a faint buzzing sound, circling around its own center of darkness. For long stretches, there was only the slow, hypnotic pulse of the sweep and a background of random specks. Sea return, noise. Sometimes the older hands called it Mickey Mouse magic. Sometimes something cruder. "Anything on your wonder box?" the captain asked, stepping in from the wing, oilskin glistening with rain. Commander Fawcett had the relaxed slouch of a man who had spent too much of his life on a heaving bridge. "Just the convoy, sir," David answered. "Most of them, anyway. Sea clutter's awful, but if a U-boat sticks its nose up within 3 miles, we'll see it." Fawcett gave a non-committal grunt. "They said the same about Azdic," he said. Then the bastard started slipping through under thermoclines. "Never forget, Lieutenant. Gadgets help, but it's still men who find and kill." David nodded, but his eyes stayed on the screen. He'd been briefed at the shore establishment. The magnetron, the narrow beam, how this new Centimetric radar could pick out a periscope at almost 1,000 yards, could see through rain that blinded older metric sets. He'd also seen the casualty lists. Azdic operators who had listened too late. Escorts that had never even known they were being shadowed. A speck flared on the tube, bright against the noise, just off the port bow, beyond the last freighter in their column. It held for 2 sweeps, then faded. "Sir, possible contact," David said quietly. "Bearing green 15, range about 2.5 miles. It came up, then dropped." Fawcett stepped closer. "Surface or aerial?" "Can't say yet. It was small, steady. Could have been a U-boat on the surface, might have dived. Or it could have been a wave," the captain said. But his tone had changed. "Keep a mark on that bearing. If it pops up again, we'll go have a look. In the meantime, signal the HFDF shack. Ask if they've got any sniff of Jerry chattering out there." David nodded. Out in the darkness, the convoy plowed on, unaware. In the early years, the bunker's map had been a place of triumph. Jonas remembered photographs from 1940 and 1941. Officers in crisp uniforms standing around the plotting table, glasses in hand, grinning as they pointed at clusters of red pins. The first happy time, the sinking of ships off the British Isles. Later, new photos in 1942 as U-boats prowled the American coast, torpedoes catching tankers silhouetted against city lights that had not yet been blacked out. Those days, the gossip in the bunker had been about how quickly they could force Britain to the negotiating table. How many tons per month would bring the island to its knees? But the mood had shifted in 1943. The Allied convoy system had hardened. Air cover stretched farther out. Losses were no longer so one-sided. The casualty boards at the far end of the bunker, once an afterthought, had grown crowded. "Stop frowning at the tally," a voice murmured at Jonas's elbow. He turned. Captain Lieutenant Kramer, senior watch officer, was watching him with a faintly amused expression. "I wasn't. You were," Kramer said. "We all were, the first time the numbers started to look uneven." He gestured at the board. Lines of chalk recorded U-boats lost, ships sunk, tonnage, dates. February had been painful. March looked worse. "Do you think these radars are the reason?" Jonas asked quietly. "The British ones. The documents about centimetric frequencies. They're not being taken seriously." Kramer shrugged. "The Admiralty experiments with many things," he said. "We do as well. Not all of them matter. There was Metox, remember? We built the set, the boats took it to sea, and suddenly they were convinced that every time it crackled, a British beam was on them. Fear travels faster than radio waves. But the British sets are probably better, yes," Kramer admitted. "They have the Americans now, and the Canadians, and their laboratories. But never forget, the ocean is vast, and our boats are many. Admiral Dönitz knows the risks. He believes the tonnage war can still be won." He paused. "And so we believe it too. That is our duty." On the map, Jonas watched the little flags of Wolfpacks being assembled, each named group a cluster of hulls and men thrown into the stormy expanse. He imagined each U-boat as a floating steel tube filled with human breath and exhaustion, pushing out into waters that had once been their hunting ground. He tried not to think of how much the meaning of that phrase had changed. On Calder, the new meaning was measured in beeps of static and shifts in bearing. The HFDF shack, a cramped compartment just below the bridge, smelled of dust and hot metal. A loop antenna turned above the deck, listening to the sky. Petty Officer Hughes sat hunched over the headphones, pencil tapping on a bearing plot. "Got something for you, sir?" Hughes said as David ducked through the hatch. "Short burst on a known U-boat frequency, bearing about green 20. That's close to what your set gave you, right?" "Green 15, David confirmed. "Range a couple of miles when it pinged." "Well then," Hughes said, offering a thin grin. "Looks like someone out there just told the pack where our convoy is, and flashed his position to us as well." They sent the bearing to the bridge. Fawcett ordered a turn. Calder peeled out of the convoy lane, her bow swinging towards the patch of night where the invisible transmission had come from. Other escorts shifted in response, like sheepdogs adjusting to a threat. On the radar, the contact reappeared, brighter now, closer. A small echo, elongated by motion. Surface contact, moving. "Target steady on bearing," David said, pulse quickening. "Range 1.8 miles, speed maybe 8 knots. Heading parallel to the convoy, sir. He's shadowing." Fawcett's voice went hard. "Action stations. Bring us to 20 knots. We'll cut him off before he finishes his message." Siren howled. Men pounded through corridors. On deck, guns creaked as they swung outboard. Searchlights stayed dark. They would do this by feel and by instruments. The sea rose around them, black and silver under a ragged scrap of moon. Calder drove forward, bow knifing through the swell, spray exploding white along the rails. The radar echo grew fatter, nearer. "Range 1 mile, 8 cables, 6. A sharp-eyed lookout on the starboard wing shouted, "There, sir, wake on the starboard bow." For a heartbeat, David saw it. A shadow on the water, low-slung, conning tower barely a darker smear against the horizon. A faint glimmer of foam at the bow, a pale line of exhaust trailing downwind. "Hard a starboard!" Fawcett snapped. "Stand by depth charges!" The U-boat, caught under a rising wave, seemed to hesitate. Then its deck lights flicked off. Someone belatedly realizing they had been running too boldly on the surface. And the shadow began to turn, stern, swinging to present its narrowest silhouette to the approaching destroyer. But the sea was against them. A swell dropped out from under the submarine, exposing more of her hull. The radar trace merged with Calder's centerline. "Steady! Steady!" Impact never came. The U-boat slid past their bow, barely 100 yards off, lost for a second behind a curtain of spray. The men on Calder glimpsed figures on the U-boat's bridge, dark shapes scrambling for the hatch. "Depth charges! Fire!" The stern racks spat steel cans into the night. Charges tumbled into the churned wake, vanishing with muffled plops. David braced himself against the bulkhead and counted under his breath. 1, 2, 3. The ocean convulsed. White-plumed columns leapt from the water astern. The sound hit the ship like a hammer, a rolling series of concussions that shook plates and rattled teeth. Calder's stern lifted, slewed, then settled, foam boiling in her wake. Men clutched to rails and waited. On the radar, the contact vanished into a smear of noise. In the bunker, many kilometers away, Jonas watched a different disappearance. U-boat UXX, no further reports, the duty clerk read from the signal board. Last transmission, contact with Convoy, no attack yet. After that, silence. Kramer exhaled slowly. "We'll give them 4 hours," he said. "If they've gone deep to evade, it may be a while before they can report again. After that, Jonas knew the boat would be moved on the status board, from active to doubtful, from doubtful to lost, eventually, if the silence held. As the hours passed and no new message came, he updated the board with a piece of chalk. A simple line, a small change in a word. But behind it, 50 men and a hull worth more than any of them alone. "You think it was radar?" he asked quietly. "Maybe," Kramer said. "Maybe HFDF. Maybe weather. Maybe a lucky escort. The British have many tools now." He leaned on the table, eyes on the North Atlantic Gap. "But they still do not have enough of them. They cannot be everywhere." By March, the gap was shrinking. Shore-based aircraft from Newfoundland and Iceland stretched their patrols further out. Long-range liberators, bristling with machine guns and equipped with new ASV radar, prowled the approaches. Escort carriers, small, slow flat tops built on merchant hulls, sailed with the convoys themselves, launching swordfish and Avengers into weather that would have grounded more delicate aircraft. David saw the first of those carriers in a gray dawn, its silhouette awkward but reassuring in the middle of the convoy. The pilots who came aboard Calder for briefings looked older than they were, eyes reddened by long watches over featureless seas. "Your new set's a wonder," one of them told David in the wardroom, nodding towards the bulkhead behind which the Type 271 hummed. "We've had 10-centimeter gear in the air for a while now. Feels like cheating sometimes, catching a U-boat flat-footed on the surface in the dark." "Do they fight?" David asked. "Sometimes," the aviator said. "Dönitz told them to stay up and shoot it out, rather than dive blind. They've even made a few flak boats, they say. More guns on the bridge. But steel on the conning tower doesn't help when our radar sees them first, and we're dropping from the clouds." He said it matter-of-factly, not boasting. Just describing a shift in the rules of the game. On Calder's radar, more and more echoes appeared that were not part of the convoy. Some were neutral ships, Some the long-armed escorts sweeping ahead and astern. Some were shadows that came close and then drifted away, as if testing the perimeter. A few ended in white blossoms on the horizon. In the bunker, rumors hardened into patterns. Reports came in of U-boats surprised on the surface at night, in heavy seas, at ranges and angles that made no sense if only human eyes and old metric radars were involved. Boats returned with tales of bombers appearing out of cloud at uncanny moments, as if the aircraft had been guided directly to them. Metox, the German radar warning receiver, stayed stubbornly silent at the crucial moments. It could pick up the long waves of older British sets, but against the new 10-centimeter signals, it was deaf. In Berlin, technical committees argued. Some insisted it was all coincidence and increasing Allied patrol density. Others whispered of something worse, that the Allies had found a way to see through the Metox screen, to illuminate the boats without warning. Officially, the conclusion was cautious. There might be a new radar, yes. It might be mounted on some escorts and aircraft, but its coverage was surely limited, its effectiveness uncertain. Besides, the ocean was large, and the tonnage war had to be won. In April, the ocean began to answer back. Operation Derange, the Second Bay Offensive, sent waves of long-range aircraft over the Bay of Biscay, hunting U-boats on the surface as they left or approached their French bases. Planes equipped with Centimetric ASV Mark III radar swept the transit lanes in all weathers, guided by Enigma decrypts and HFDF. Boats that once cruised on the surface to conserve batteries now faced an invisible net. In the bunker, Jonas watched as red crosses sprouted along the routes to sea. "Another one?" the plotting officer muttered as a signal came in from a survivor-laden rescue ship. Attacked in the bay. Aircraft appeared out of nowhere. Metox never made a sound. Kramer stood in front of the tally board for a long moment, then turned to Jonas. "Signal from BDU," he said, voice flat. "All boats are to resist on the surface when attacked by aircraft. Use flak to drive them off. Do not rely on crash dives alone." "On the surface?" Jonas repeated. "Against bombers. We cannot hide from them underwater if they can see us before we know they are there," Kramer said quietly. "At least on the surface, the guns can speak." In practice, the order doomed more boats than it saved. The U-boats' guns were brave but crude compared to the coordinated fire of escorts and the surprises dropping from clouds. In May, U-boats died in the bay in 1s and 2s and 3s. And far out in the Atlantic, something else was building. The convoy's name was ONS-5. To the men aboard the merchantman, it was just another slow westbound crossing, burdened with coal and manufactured goods, bound for North America. To the men in the escort group, it was a slog through the worst weather the North Atlantic could muster. To Dönitz and his staff, Jonas among them, it was a prize worth blood. In late April, reports began to filter in. U-boats sighted in the vicinity, HFDF bearings on the Allied side. The dance began. On Calder's Bridge, the storm was a living thing. Wind howled across the bow, blowing spray horizontal. Waves climbed higher than the destroyer's bridge windows. Sometimes, as the ship pitched into a trough, all David could see ahead was a wall of water that crashed down over the forecastle like a moving cliff. Radar did not care about walls of water. The Type 271's little display hummed, its green line sweeping tirelessly around, ignoring rain and darkness alike. "Most of the pack's up there," Hughes said, tapping a pencil on the HFDF plot he had taped to the bulkhead. "Plenty of chatter. They're trying to get ahead of us." "Do they know exactly where we are?" David asked. "Oh, they've got a good idea," Hughes said. "But every time one of them breaks radio silence, we get a bearing, and every bearing is another step closer." He looked almost cheerful about it. Technicians across the Allied navies had felt the change in the past months. Instead of always reacting, they were finally starting to dictate the terms. The storm, perversely, helped both sides. It sheltered the convoy from long-range aircraft, but also hampered the escort's gunnery and ASDIC. Radar and HFDF became their primary eyes. On one brutal night, Calder rode herd on the starboard side of the convoy, while the wind screamed and the tops of the waves were ripped into horizontal sheets of foam. David watched the screen until his eyes ached. A small echo appeared just outside the convoy perimeter. Then another. Then a third. "Multiple contacts, sir," he said quietly. "They're on the surface, working their way in." Fawcett's jaw tightened. "They're coming in under cover of the storm," he said. "Very well. Signal the group. We'll push them back." Escorts peeled away, roaring into the night like angry sheepdogs. Radar beams swept across the waves, picking out the brief, lethal silhouettes of U-boats exposed between seas. One contact grew suddenly larger. David shouted bearing and range. Calder heeled over, turning towards the threat. For a fleeting moment, a U-boat rode the crest of a wave broadside on to them, decks awash, gun crews clinging to rails as they tried to work their weapons in the gale. Muzzle flashes winked, feeble against the storm. Tracers slashed the dark, whipped sideways by the wind. Calder's forward guns replied. Shells exploded in quick orange bursts around the conning tower. The submarine vanished behind a curtain of spray. "Depth charges!" Fawcett snapped. "Drop on the last echo!" The thunder that followed was muffled by the storm's own voice, but when the echoes on the display thinned and one faded altogether, nobody on Calder celebrated. There was no cheering, only a grim, exhausted satisfaction and the knowledge that somewhere below, steel was tearing and water was rushing in. In the bunker, ONS-5's battle played out in fragments. Convoy attacked, heavy weather, torpedoes fired, 3 ships claimed, boat reports under depth charge attack, structural damage, attempting to disengage. Contact with U-boat lost after brief signal, presumed sunk. The messages came in encoded, decoded, pinned, moved. Jonas traced the shifting lines of the battle with a growing hollow in his stomach. "These losses," he began, then stopped. He wasn't supposed to comment on numbers beyond his pay grade. Bremer scowled up at the board. "Storm conditions," he said, as if arguing with it. "The escorts can't maintain proper screen discipline. It's just bad luck. Bad luck that seems to happen more often lately," Jonas said before he could stop himself. Bremer's gaze flicked to him, sharp. "Careful, Weber." "Yes, Herr Kapitän." Later that night, when the directorate was quiet and the coffee in the urn had grown stale, Jonas found Kramer standing alone in front of the tallies. "The convoy lost 13 ships," Kramer said without preamble. "But we have confirmation that at least 6 boats are gone, possibly 7. He tapped the board where chalk circles marked U-boats that had gone silent after reporting attacks. "That's a disastrous exchange," Jonas said quietly. Kramer nodded. "BDU is calling ONS-5 a victory," he said. "The tonnage sunk, the disruption. But inside the staff, they know what this rate of loss means. If every convoy costs us 6 boats, we will bleed out before the year is through." He looked older in the yellow light, the lines around his eyes deeper. "And the damned toy radar?" Jonas asked. Kramer's mouth twisted. "Not a toy," he said. "Not anymore, if it ever was. We have reports of boats being detected at night, in fog, at ranges where only a new kind of set could have seen them." He sighed. "We underestimated the enemy, Weber, and the Atlantic doesn't forgive that." 2 weeks later, convoy SC-130 crossed the ocean. The details differed. Different ships, different storm fronts, different wave patterns. But the pattern of the battle was the same. U-boats converged in packs. HFDF and Centimetric radar picked up their shadowing moves. Aircraft from escort carriers and land bases dropped out of cloud banks on boats that thought themselves safe in the gloom. 5 U-boats died for no Allied losses. On Calder, David received the news as a series of laconic signals from Admiralty. SC-130 attacks repelled, stop multiple U-boats sunk, stop no convoy losses, stop well done all concerned. In the wardroom that night, over thin soup and 2 strong coffee, the officers allowed themselves a rare, brittle laughter. "Do you think this is it?" the first lieutenant asked. "Have we finally turned the corner?" Fawcett considered his mug for a long moment. "We've bloodied them," he said. "Badly. Enough that they'll think twice about coming at well-escorted convoys in daylight or dark. But don't imagine they're finished. Not while Hitler still demands miracles from them." He paused. "But yes, for the first time in years, I feel as though we're hunting them, and not the other way around." In the bunker, the word catastrophe was not used in official communiques. The language of command preferred phrases like unacceptable losses and temporary withdrawal. But Jonas heard the other words in the mess hall. He saw them in the slumped shoulders of wireless operators who came off duty and stared at the floor instead of the chalk tallies. In May 1943, the U-boat arm suffered its worst month of the war. 41 U-boats were destroyed, roughly a quarter of the operational fleet at sea. Depending on how one counted, 42 or 43 boats never came home. In the same period, Allied losses fell. 58 ships lost worldwide, 34 in the Atlantic. The exchange, once the pride of the tonnage war, had turned into a hemorrhage. When the figures were compiled and placed on Admiral Dönitz's desk, he read them, sat very still for a moment, then reached for his pen. A signal went out to every operational U-boat. Suspend offensive operations in North Atlantic convoy routes. Withdraw to new operating areas. Review tactics. The Battle of the Atlantic has entered a new phase. The official phrasing was more ornate, but that was the meaning. In the bunker, Jonas read the draft and felt something loosen inside his chest. Relief and dread in equal measure. "So that's it," he said softly. "We're giving up the Central Atlantic." Kramer, standing beside him, nodded. "For now," he said, "we will shift to other waters. Coastal attacks, Arctic convoys, maybe further south. But yes, as far as the main battle is concerned..." He looked at the board, at the thick cluster of pins that had marked the northwestern approaches. "We have lost." He did not say, "lost the war," only the battle. But they both knew that the convoy lanes had been the jugular. With them secure, the Allies could build up men and machines for whatever came next. "Do the men at sea know?" Jonas asked. "They will soon enough," Kramer said. "They'll smell it in the orders, in the way we start talking about holding on instead of victory." He placed his pencil down, very carefully. "We were arrogant," he said finally. "We believed the ocean itself was our ally. Now it belongs to whoever can see first in the dark." On Calder, the news arrived as a quieter sea. It wasn't that U-boats vanished entirely. They still lurked, still struck when they could, still sent ships down. But the great pack attacks faded. The nights when radar screens blossomed with echoes and HFDF plots looked like hedgehogs of intersecting lines became rarer. The Escort still stood their vigils, but the air above the convoys felt less crowded with unseen perils. One evening in late May, with the convoy plodding west under a patchwork sky, David stepped out onto the open bridge wing. The wind had eased to a steady, almost gentle breeze. The sea was still steel gray, but the waves were long and smooth, their crests feathered with white instead of torn into fangs. He rested his hands on the cold railing and closed his eyes for a moment, listening. There was always sound aboard, engines thrumming, water rushing along the hull, shouted orders carried up from the decks. But compared to the maelstrom of earlier crossings, it felt almost peaceful. Fawcett joined him, lighting a cigarette with cupped hands. "Radar quiet?" he asked. "Mostly convoy echoes," David said. "A few distant blips, but they're probably our own group." "And HFDF?" "Hughes says the U-boat frequencies are quiet tonight, almost eerily so." Fawcett exhaled, smoke streaming away into the dark. "Black May," he said softly. "That's what they're calling it in the briefing rooms ashore. For the Germans, not for us." David had heard the numbers. Word got around even when it wasn't supposed to. "Do you think they'll stop?" he asked. "The U-boats?" Fawcett shook his head. "Not completely. There will always be another boat, another patrol, but they've been hurt badly enough that the main offensive is broken. From now on, unless we grow complacent, we'll be the ones dictating terms." He glanced at the radar cabinet through the bridge window, its faint green glow reflected in the glass. "They laughed at these sets at first," he said. "Called them toys. Some of our own people did too. Funny thing about toys, though. Boys who learn to use them properly often grow up to run the world." David smiled faintly. "I don't feel like we're running anything, sir. Just surviving a little better." "That's a start," Fawcett said. Years later, when the war was long over and the bunkers were empty and the gray hulls either scrapped or anchored in museums, the men who had survived found themselves in quieter rooms with different maps. Jonas, hair thinner and eyes tired, stood one chilly autumn afternoon on a headland near Kiel. Before him, the sea stretched out under a low, iron sky. At his back, a stone memorial to the U-boat crews listed names and hull numbers. Too many to take in fully. He traced the carved outline of a submarine with his fingertips. The stone was cold. He remembered the map room in France, the smug confidence, the joking dismissal of new toys in enemy hands, the chalk lines on the casualty board, the way they had filled and filled until there was no space left. He remembered, too, the faces of the few U-boat men he'd met when they came ashore between patrols. Young, tired, pale from weeks without sunlight, smelling of diesel and metal. Average age not much different from his own at the time. Most of them had not lived to see this memorial. Beside him, an older man in a British Navy surplus coat shifted his weight. They had met by chance at a veterans gathering, surprised to find they had both once stared at the same patch of ocean from opposite sides. "You were in the command bunker?" the man, David, had asked. "And you?" Jonas had replied. "Destroyer Escort," David said, "with radar and HFDF. We chased your boats in 43, ONS 5, SC 130. Those names mean anything to you?" They had, very much. Now they stood together, two men linked by a shared battle and decades of peace, listening to the wind. "We thought your radar was a bluff," Jonas said at last, English now easier on his tongue than it had been in his youth. "At first, anyway. We had our own scientists, but we told ourselves you couldn't possibly have leapt so far ahead, that the ocean would always protect us at night." David smiled ruefully. "Plenty of our own people thought the same," he said. "About code breaking, about HFDF, about everything. It took a long time for the old guard to accept that the war wasn't just big guns and sharp eyes anymore." He looked out at the sea. "Funny, isn't it? We both underestimated our enemies and our own engineers in different ways." "We paid for it more dearly," Jonas said quietly. "Perhaps," David said. "But in the end, everyone paid. Merchant sailors, U-boat crews, escorts. The ocean doesn't care who is arrogant and who is humble. It just takes." They fell silent for a moment. "Do you ever think about those nights?" Jonas asked. "About men drowning in the dark because of a line on a screen, or a bearing from a radio transmission?" "Every time I hear thunder," David said softly. "I remember depth charges going off behind me. Every time I see a green glow in a doctor's waiting room, I think of that radar tube." He shrugged. "But I also remember the convoys that got through, the supplies that fed Britain, the troops that crossed in 44. They reached their destination because we learned faster than you did that the world had changed." Jonas nodded slowly. "In the bunker we had a saying," he said. "Der Ozean gehört dem, der zuerst sieht." The ocean belongs to the one who sees first. "That sounds about right," David said. "And in 43, we finally opened our eyes." They stood there a little longer, two old men watching a sea that no longer held Wolfpacks or convoys, just cargo ships that sailed in peacetime freedom. The wind smelled the same as it had in 1943, salt and cold and something metallic from distant harbors. Waves still curled and broke against the shore with indifferent regularity. But somewhere beneath that surface, in the cold layers where wrecks slept and magnetrons rusted in their housings, the memory of a different Atlantic lingered, an ocean where men had once mocked a new kind of vision, right up until the month its green glowing eyes turned the hunting ground into a killing zone and broke the back of the wolf packs they had trusted too much.